Welcome to Cat Space. This is the first of many. Welcome back, Cat Spaces. I'm Cat. This is Buckets, and our lifelong dear friend and co-host Leon. How are you?
Check out the logo.
Check out the logo. It's so cool. Before we start, we are on YouTube. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button and don't forget to push that notification bell. You get all the content and podcasts from all of us here at Catspace. And if you like what you see, leave us a comment and let us know what topic you like. We'll even give you a shout out and invite your friends. Let's get started. So today's topic is celebrating the 90s. We are going back in time once again. First question is, was the 90s just a past 80s in disguise?
That's an interesting question. I suppose you could say yes, because, well, if you think about it, the 90s was the 80s in disguise, the 80s was the 70s in disguise, and the 70s was the 60s in disguise. Uh, I don't, I don't necessarily think so. I suppose you could say the late 80s kicked into what the 90s was going to be. Obviously, we had the Eurodance stuff coming in the late 80s, and that was what pretty much right through until the mid 90s. So there was a 10-year bit of, as far as at least about 80s to 90s music went.
What do you think?
I think a lot of it's interesting because the early 90s, sorry, the early 80s was very much futuristic, technological, that sort of thing. And then it was about 1989 where things started to change a little bit. And then the 90s began to begin to develop. So all these things like, say, hip hop, for example, that was basically 60s, 70s, and 80s, and amalgamations of 60s, 70s, 80s. And then in the 90s, it really took off. So you had artists like Will Smith in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Snoop Dogg, all those guys.
Eminem.
Well, no,
Beastie
Eminem wasn't
Boys.
90s at all, but you had all these
Beastie
guys
Boys
come,
did, yeah.
that were beginning from the um, we're beginning from the 80s. We're just juniors at the 80s. And then they really blossomed in the 90s. They were basically unheard of in the 80s.
OPP?
And then, I don't, can I speak? Is that all right?
Isn't that Naughty by Nature? Wasn't that Naughty by Nature a Public Enemy with OPP?
Yep.
But then they didn't really, but then they really began to blossom in the 90s. The 90s is the one thing that really shot them out of where they started to become household names. And that's what I think really what happened.
That would have been the very late 80s / very early 90s, I would imagine.
Yes.
Just going off the top of my head, I can imagine that.
Speaking of,
It's funny because the end of the decade brought us into this, obviously the start of the next decade, but yet that was already in between. That pretty much kicked off our hip hop era, all that stuff, that mainstream hip hop.
and here's where the second question ties in with the first, which is, did 90s music create a new sexual revolution?
I think it
No,
actually
I don't
did.
think so.
I
don't
actually
think I don't think it did. You're going. Well, I'll go on. You explain yours, and I'll say no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, looking at it, to me it did, because you're looking at, when it came to 90s R&B and hip hop, it was very sexual. Even to this day, it's very sexualized, where it just talked about really graphical stuff and really sexual stuff, and it made girls, come across as, sexual. And you had Salt and Pepper, Let's Talk About Sex, and What a Man, by Salt and Pepper. You had En Vogue, you had Destiny's Child. You had all these groups that were so sexualized in their videos and their music and the words and the lyrics. And if you look into it, and rap and hip hop and R&B, I believe it did create a sexual revolution to make women not just feel empowered, but to make, you know, music a bit more sort of, a bit more naughtier, a bit more sexier, a bit more sensual, a bit more you know, adult rated rather than, you know, 90s, you know, most kids that listen to that, you know, their parents wouldn't allow them to, because at the time it was not just taboo, but it was like, if you listen to that kind of music, you're listening to, you know, music that is not sort of wholesome, if you don't mind me saying so. What do you think?
I think that, look, I remember I went to a school called St. Charles in Ryde, and I remember we were doing, we were reading books, and we had basically they had like an hour's worth of quiet time, and we were reading no, we were actually learning how to read and write, and we were learning how to do spelling. Do you remember those old school spelling things that used to go? Anyway, um, one of the song my teacher was actually kind enough to actually play the music that was on the radio, and I was actually, we as a classroom were allowed to listen to a La 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 Long by by Inner Circle.
Wow,
And,
Inner
That
Circle,
song.
that was
and I
93.
was
That
in year
was
5 when that
93.
was happening, and that was perfectly fine. If that was in say when if that was in, say, the 80s, they never would have even thought of doing music like that. It would have been completely thrown out the window or whatever.
Mind you, I agree with your point, which is you raise a strong point. If you look at that song and look at Color Me Bad with I Want to Sex You Up, and, you know, all that sort of stuff being the 90s R&B hip hop OG music revolutionized the sexual period of the 90s, which has made made music so current, and even to this day mainstream and adulterated, and, you know, it sort of forced, you know, sort of parents to ban that music from their kids, unless kids went to their school dances and danced to that and were listening to them in their Walkman without their parents knowing, and all that sort of consent. And I strongly believe that that's what R&B, hip hop, OG music, you know, rap, you know, became so revolutionary sexy, because you had in
I
the
actually, hmm, go on. I believe it was becoming sexualized in the mid 70s, because I'm going back to further than the 90s. I'm going back to the 70s, because there was a song at the time which was deemed, I think it was deemed borderline pornographic, even though it wasn't a pornographic song. None of that. But the song was called "Love to Love You Baby" by Donna Summer. That was roughly 1975. That was the first really sexualized kind of song. And then we go to the 80s. I'm just trying to think. There was a song out in the 80s as well. I just
Well,
can't
let's see. There
remember.
was George Michael, "I Love Your Sex." I
Yeah.
want your sex.
I Want Your Sex. That would have been the late. That would have been the mid to late 80s as well. So it was kind of bubbling. The sexualization of songs was kind of bubbling at the time,
But it
just
wasn't
like
neat.
slowly.
It wasn't
And
nearly as a blossom or as a boom in the
until the
90s.
90s,
Even
it's
like
it,
in the 90s, it just took off like a rocket.
yeah.
And I just remembered that every single video clip basically had sexual scenes as well. And that was acceptable. It was fine. And
and
no one's complaining about it either.
and don't forget, you know, going to the 90s is like, if you look at majority of kids, or, you know, teens or preteens or children, or, you know, young adults, that were listening to things like Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Iron Maiden. They were listening to Queen, David Bowie. They were listening to heavy metal. They were listening to alternative music, Michael Jackson, you know, and all that stuff. But 90s, you know, the revolution of sexual content, sexual lyrics, sexual words. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, what do you think?
Now,
Well,
Daddy, you mentioned David Bowie. That was the one guy that I was thinking of, because he did have a video in the, I think it was the early 80s, called China Girl, if I remember it right. And the end scene, he's frolicking naked on a beach with a woman on the beach, naked. That wasn't banned at the time of the 80s. So
No.
there you go. That's one of those examples for you right now. It was very sexualized at that time.
you what? Well, I just remembered that African American people, or I really should say African American stars, really started to come out during the 80s. And I remember again, like when I went to St. Charles, I went from Villa Maria to St. Charles, and everyone was into basketball, and everyone wanted to be a homeboy, and everyone wanted to be part of a gang and all that. And everyone listened to hip hop music and everything like that. And that was like a complete cultural change for me, because I was like, well, like this is awesome, but it's so different. It was like walking into a completely different culture where um everyone's just wants, it was almost like everyone wanted to be on the streets fighting a street war. It was just so crazily weird, but that was the culture at the time. That's what was in. There was, you had all this streets violence, streets pop, everything to do with um, everything to do with the street was just in, kind of thing. And it was raw and it was fun and it was exhilarating.
That's right. And don't forget, going back to the 90s, is the 90s ushered in and welcomed in techno, dance, trance, and house music.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking more along the lines of that Eurodance stuff. We're talking Technotronic, Snap, Two Unlimited. Just those three. Those three basically started in the 90s.
That's right.
They really got their flow going in the 90s. But I think all of them, I believe, started in the late 80s, but they didn't start making mainstream until the 90s.
Can I ask you, what is your favorite genre of music for the 90s? If you could pick one or two, what would be your highlight?
It was so hard to choose from. There were so many great ones.
Yeah, I agree with Philip. It's hard to choose. I guess you could say I was more of a pop slash rock kind of person, more top 50. I suppose you could call that three. I suppose I'm more like a three genres. Mainly would be pop, rock, and top 50.
Speaking of top 50 or top 40s and pop, don't forget also in the 90s, we had boom, like, let's begin from the 80s. Well, even before that, we had Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. Then that exploded. And then we had New Kids on the Block in the 80s. Then after them came the Backstreet Boys, then NSYNC, then Britney, then Christina Aguilera. And now we have nowadays Christina Aguilera, Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake. We have, the exploding boom of not just solo girl artists like Christina and Britney, but we had boom like Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Five, O-Town. You had NKOTB. You had those sort of big boy bands that girls fawned over and went crazy for.
Here's one for you to get your mind thinking again. You talk about boy bands, an old girl band back in the early 90s called Eternal, the UK British girl band.
Oh my God, that's going back. I've heard of Eternal.
That was around 1990. That was around 94, 96 ish. That had to have been something along those lines.
I've never heard of them. Now
I've actually got a couple of their CDs. I've still got a couple of their CDs in my collection. I can't believe that. That's like 30 years now.
And don't forget, Will Smith did kind of dominate the 90s.
Yeah, I think that was a driving force, because I remember everyone wanted to be like Will Smith, and he was part of the French. I just say French. The Fresh Prince of Bel Air.
I am Le Will Smith. I'm Le Fresh Prince of Bel Air.
Because don't forget, Fresh Prince of Bel Air was such a popular TV show. And Will Smith, his music, the wonderful thing about Will Smith is his music did not in any way, shape, or form have any sexual content. He was actually quite clean.
I don't know about that. It kind of did.
It had no swear words.
But it was pretty classy.
Boom Shake the Room did. Boom Shake the Room had some suggestive lyrics in it.
Really?
Yeah, and so did his other song about Miami chicks and all that.
That song was just called Miami.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay, next question. And here's where the fun begins on Castface. I wrote down my favorite TV shows, and I want to see both your favorite TV shows are. For me, it was Full House, Blossom, Married with Children, Fresh Prince of Bel Air, Beverly Hills 90210, Party of Five, Melrose Place, Dawson's Creek, Neighbors, Home and Away, and The Nanny were all part of the 90s. I'm not a fan of the Neighbors or Home and Away, but The Nanny, Dawson's Creek, Melrose Place, Party of Five, Beverly Hills 90210, Fresh Prince, Married with Children, Blossom, and Full House, and Family Ties, and what's the other sitcom with Steve Urkel?
Family Matters.
Family Matters, that's the one. What's your favorite TV shows out of all that?
Well, you
All
can't
those.
say Family Ties can't qualify for this because
Oh, I
Family
forgot Growing
Ties was
Pains.
an 80s
Yeah, but that was
show.
80s as well. See, Growing
That was
Pains
an
and
80s
Family
show.
Times, that was basically the
Family
same
Ties.
era, and they were both 80s. So,
And,
But they
actually,
did.
and just for the record, Family Ties ended in 1989.
Oh, okay. What about Growing Pains?
same time.
Same time?
Growing Pains. Oh, hang on. I'll have a look at that. Go on, while you guys.
He's going to fact check this.
He's gonna fact check. I like
Yeah.
the fact that he fact checks.
No, Growing Pains was around until 1992.
Okay, you've just made the grade.
Just qualified.
But out of all these TV shows, what are your favorite TV shows? Like, what would you sit down back then and watch? That the big square TV at the time. What would you sit down and watch?
Oh my gosh. I was always a Disney fan, so one of my favorites at the time would have been Dinosaurs. That was one.
Oh,
That was from
yes.
91 to 94.
That was a good one.
That's now on Disney Plus, actually, I believe. I don't know if DuckTales qualifies because that was
We're
another one
talking
of my
cartoons now or
favorites.
actual TV shows.
They're TV shows kind of deal.
But you know what?
I was always a fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yes,
yes,
that
same.
too.
That started around
TMNT.
1997. I think it ended in 96, I think. The
Captain
original
Planet.
version.
Captain Planet's another one.
Captain Planet. I remember that one. I just haven't.
Yeah, that was
You
1990.
can get. I think you can get the box. I think you can get the box set of Captain Planet these days. I'm pretty sure you can.
Captain Planet was the TV show that brought the information of saving the planet, being environmentally
think-
friendly.
I think it was basically Captain Planet was the one show that actually made saving the planet fun and
Yeah.
not boring.
Yeah.
Every other
Absolutely.
show made it boring or kid-like, but Captain Planet actually made it fun and interesting.
And
It was-
education.
it's actually the one of the few that could actually pull that off.
And speaking of cartoons, which I can't believe I neglected to mention, one of my all-time favorite cartoons, it actually still is going today.
The
The
Simpsons.
Simpsons.
Yes,
There you
sir.
go. That's still going. We're on season 32 in the right now in Australia. We're actually airing season 32, I think, right now.
We're ushering season 31 on Disney Plus. Sorry, Disney Plus. I don't have to
Uh,
quote them, though. Hi, Disney
think-
Plus.
no, I
If you're
think
watching,
one-
I
I
just
think
talking.
one of the new seasons is coming out on Disney Plus in actually this week, I believe. The newest season, if I
Now-
remember right.
But with these TV shows, I'm looking at Full House, Blossom, Married with Children, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Beverly Hills, Party of Five, Melrose Place, Dawson's Creek. Which one of those were your favorites, and which one would you sit down and watch? I mean, for me, I grew up with Beverly Hills 90210. I grew up with all these shows. I mean, Party of Five I wasn't a massive fan of, but Dawson's Creek I watched because nonstop. But all the rest of these shows were really highlights from my childhood.
It's the thing is, I hated Beverly Hills 91210.
No,
Those
no,
kind of
no.
sitcoms.
Well, I mean, how can you call them? I know people called them sitcoms, but I never found them funny. So I did have my favorites. You know what I used to love? I actually loved the show Amazing, and that was a show that was
Yes, that was more like a generally to kids strategy kind of maze
Yeah.
shows on Channel 7, if I remember right.
yeah, and they
I
took
loved watching that show. I loved watching that one. It's about finding keys in hidden places.
that's right, and spelling words for which they've probably stolen off Big, which is fantastic because I loved Big as well. But it was basically they got kids to spell words, and after that play video games. What more could you want?
And also, here's one for you. I think that would have come about because of a show that you actually also was on Channel 7 in the 80s. I don't know if it was on in the 90s. Now You See It. It was basically a find the
I've heard
word
the
kind
show.
of thing. I loved that show. That show was probably what got me interested in Find the Words because I'm one of the masters of Find the Words, man.
If
But
I
I
could,
loved watching that show back when I was a kid.
if I could go back in Australian history, you're looking at Wheel of Fortune, Sale of the Century,
Oh
The
my
Price is
lord, that's
Right,
right.
Battle of the Sexes, and It's in the Bag.
Do you know what I
I
really
don't
miss?
remember. I don't remember Battle of the Sexes, and I don't remember In the Bag. But
Larry Emder
as
was
far
actually the
as
host of it.
I do. I
Larry Emder
I
was the host.
now I loved watching Sail of the Century because for, I would just like go trivia one on one with my late mum while doing that, and also Wheel of Fortune. I was just a beast at Wheel of Fortune,
The
but
Price is Right.
Sail of the Century, not so much The Price is Right, but I remember watching. I remember watching an episode of The Price is Right. Now that you mentioned it, with Larry Emder, and I had the hiccup girl. I don't know. I don't remember. I don't remember her name, but every time she started laughing, she started hiccuping. You'll be able to find it on YouTube for sure, no doubt about it.
Also, don't forget with Bert Newton, Good Morning Australia. He was the champion of that for so many years.
Who was it?
Good Morning Australia with Bert Newton,
Ah, yes, yeah, you're right.
with the
You know
legendary and
what?
iconic Bert Newton.
Did you ever remember a
Yes.
show called Man Oh Man? Do you remember that show?
Ooh,
Okay, so
I partially remember something about that, but I just don't remember
basically
what it
what
was
they
all
did
about.
was they got four of the most boganous men that you could think of, for which they would fight each other out in the most bogan methods you could think of, and whoever was the winner
Ah,
basically married the chicken at the end.
did you know the chick or the chicken at the end?
No, the chick. I mean, it's not Hey Hey It's Saturday. Don't get me wrong. I loved Hey Hey It's
Hey,
Saturday.
hey,
Oh,
it's
so did
Saturday. You
I
mean
actually.
perfect match? You mean perfect match, don't you? Not hey, hey, it's Saturday. Oh,
I remember
what a
Perfect Match. Perfect Match was like, oh my god, that was the worst show ever. That's like, it's terrible, that show.
speaking of shows like that from the 90s, what about Gladiators?
Yes,
The
yes,
I actually
yes,
love
yes,
that
original
yes,
version
yes,
show.
of
yes.
Gladiators.
I love
It's
that show.
I
the
loved it.
Gladiators was like Australian Ninja Warrior, whatever it's called. Australian
Yeah,
Ninja.
basically, yeah.
I love the other show. What was Who
It's a
Dares
knockout.
Who
Wins?
Dares Wins?
What about
Remember
It's a
that show?
Knockout? That's one for. I don't know if that made it through to the 90s, but It's a Knockout was definitely an 80s show.
I'm pretty
Um,
sure that was a 90s
I'm
show.
pretty sure too as well.
It wasn't. Yeah, it was Who Dares Wins, and basically they would, do a dare, and if the contestant chickened out, then they'd get the co-host to do it instead, and they'd get them to do things like do the whole shopping naked whilst basically wearing sprayed on clothes.
Now, before we
wait,
can,
do shopping naked. What was the theme to the show? The Streak by Ray Stevens?
Yeah,
before we go back to TV shows,
it had Mike Whitney in it. That's right.
before we go back to TV
Oh my
shows,
god.
let's go back to the new music of the 90s. And my question was there a massive surge in boy bands for the 90s? And we're talking about people like Five, O-Town, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, NKOTB. We're talking about, Boys to Men, Westlife, you name it. Was there, I believe there was a surge in boy
I
bands.
think the 90s was pretty much the
Boy
decade for
bands, yeah.
boy bands, and more so than any other decade in history, because the thing is, after the 90s, okay, heading towards the 2000s, everyone started to make fun of boy bands. But in the 90s, everyone loved them.
Yeah, I mean, for
Well,
example,
you realize back in the 60s, they were just called boy bands were basically called rock and roll bands, like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. There you go. Deep Purple is another one.
Jackson
They
5.
weren't classified as a boy band. They're not classified as boy
No,
bands,
no,
but I
and they were
reckon at the time
classified as
they
musicians.
might have been if they were. You know, if the genre was boy bands, back in the 60s, and I reckon you would have seen a few of them. They
Don't
were like the
forget,
Beach Boys, the Beatles would have been classified as boy bands.
it's because they dress the same way as well. They were all made to dress the same way, look the same way. The dance moves were
Yeah.
all the same way.
I actually remember Boys to Men, and how big they were
Oh my God,
during
yes.
the 90s.
In the
Okay.
early 90s, yeah.
And they just took the world by storm. In fact, I have to say that out of all the decades, probably African American music just killed the music. And if white musicians didn't adopt hip hop into their repertoire, they were just kicked aside and forgotten about, basically.
But what I'm talking about is the surge of boy bands. For example, you're looking at Westlife, Five, O-Town, Boys to Men, Backstreet Boys, and Sync. You're looking at them dressing the same way, singing the same songs, dancing the same way. I mean, the surge was incredibly like charged. Like you had girls screaming at the top of their lungs when they were like at sellout arenas. Look at this day and age. I mean, I know this is the 90s, but if you look at 1D, for example, 1D began on the X Factor and Simon Cowell put them together, and look what happened for 5 years. It's like take for example BTS. In this generation, BTS are a boy band. They're musicians, but they're boy bands. Boy bands had a massive surge in the 90s.
Yeah, they did.
I agree. Boy bands did really explode in the 90s because there were so many. And I reckon it all would have started with the likes of New Kids on the Block because when they first came up on the scene, I think it was around 1986.
Yeah.
Or even if we go back as far as New Edition, because they go back a
Oh,
little
yes.
bit further. I reckon New Edition led the way for like New Kids on the Block, which therefore led the way for was it the Backstreet Boys or something along those lines.
But don't forget, the Jackson 5 led the way for New Edition, led the way to, they began the whole
But
boy band
they
thing.
weren't technically considered, like, even though by definition they're a boy band, they weren't
definitely,
really
because Michael
considered a
Jackson
boy
was
band.
about 5 or 6 years old when what was Michael Jackson, about 8 or 9 when the Jackson 5 came up back in 1970-ish?
7 or 8, I think.
Yeah,
But
I think it was
they
like
pay.
1970s,
Philip says they may not have been considered as a boy band, but they were 5 brothers who were technically a boy band, even though they played instruments and sang and danced.
Today's modern standards, they are considered a boy band, but in their own era, they wouldn't have been considered a boy band. They would have just been considered a family band.
That's why I mentioned the likes of the Beatles. That's why I mentioned the likes of the Rolling Stones as well, because in their era they might have been considered boy bands. Even though technically they were in their teens, but still technically, I guess that would call them a preteen boy band or preteen band or something along those lines. Maybe.
Okay,
here's the next question. Did American sports in Australia begin to blossom during the 90s? And we're talking about baseball, basketball, softball.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I remember
gridiron. Gridiron is like our footy.
So basketball, I remember, was not nearly as popular until you heard things like Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Shaquille O'Neal. That's when people started to take real interest in basketball. Before, like, I just remember.
Hence why we got that phrase, "White man can't jump." Hence why we got that phrase.
Exactly, and that would have only come in because people had an interest in American basketball. And I just remember when it was like, who's your favorite team? It was either the Chicago Bulls or the Sydney Kings, and you only knew like one player of the Sydney Kings, which was Andrew Gaze, and that was it. But you knew every single player of Chicago Bulls in a foreign
LA
country
Lakers,
for which most people haven't been to.
Or Miami Heat. But the thing is, did American sports, because don't forget what they have in common with us is not just basketball, but they also have in common with us, which is their Super Bowl or gridiron is like our state of origin, two big sides coming together to
It's got a football, that's true, but it's not the same game.
We don't use pads like they do.
No, and we don't use helmets.
They use pads and get stretched off, man. We just hit each other and get stretched off.
Like, I would say it's a completely different game.
Yeah.
If you're looking at gridiron is a bit like chess, where they're basically trying to get to part of the um, each part of the field,
And
and
they get to
that's
the
why they
end real
constantly
quickly.
stop starting, because each player is like a chess piece.
Yes.
But in normal football, in rugby, in union, in even AFL, you have actual positions, and they're either
And
trying
in
to kick a
gridiron, you're
goal.
allowed to do forward passes. See, in gridiron, yes, but you
Yeah,
can't do it. You can't do it in our rugby union or rugby league.
but it is interesting to note that American football was always popular in the movies, okay, but it was really popular during the 90s everywhere.
This
And
is
I remember everyone had football caps and stuff like that, like gridiron caps, because that was also in. Um, and it was just as popular as basketball, if not just a little bit under, but still really popular. Um, and it was massively in. And I remember the two most popular American sports that were currently in were basketball and baseball. Everyone loved baseball.
Yes, but
Everyone loved
if you
baseball.
look at it, when it comes to gridiron, for example, they have their helmets and they have their pads and stuff, and they're actually, because if they get injured, when they get hit, they get injured and hit, but they're protected. Our players only wear the masking tape on their heads, or and they don't wear helmets, and when they get knocked, they're not good, and it hurts. But when it comes to things like basketball, you're right, basketball or baseball, you know we play hockey as well. They play hockey, so that's what I'm saying. Is American Did American sports blossom in the 90s for us?
I just remember when the Mighty Ducks came out on in the movies, that got everyone interested in the
In
Mighty
hockey.
Ducks, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden they create a team called the Mighty Ducks, which is actually a real team now.
I remember that. You know, it's really weird how different countries have their own style of favorite sports and stuff like that. England and Australia, we both have similar interests. Like we go cricket, rugby league. The UK, they got a few things differently. They got a few things better than us, like soccer. They've
Yeah.
got darts. They are the UK are a sports mad country. We
Like
are not
us.
that. We're not that. No, we're not that. Well, let's just say we're two worlds apart when it comes to being mad sports fanatics. No, I've been to the UK and I know for a fact that we're two different. We're two different apart. We're two different apart.
Well, can you really blame the UK? Because if you think about it, right, it's so freaking cold that they want to basically grab onto sports where they get to drink a couple of lagers and throw pointy edged darts at a wall. Because that's what I would be doing if I was in the UK. Where us Australians have the beauty of the sun, and we can go out and play beach volleyball
Okay.
or cricket or beach cricket.
Beach volleyball.
Moving on across from sports.
Ladies and gentlemen, Phil wants to play beach volleyball. We are in winter right now. Good
Moving
luck.
on
Enjoy your
from
shrinkage.
sports. Moving on from sports. Favorite foods of the 90s. And I wrote down from my research pizzas, burgers and fries, hot dogs, TV meals. And in Australia, we're looking at hundreds and thousands on fairy bread and shapes.
Yeah, look, you know what? I remember when the TV
And chips.
I remember when
chips
the TV dinner
and
came out.
chocolates.
I remember when the TV dinner came out, and that was the most exciting thing. And if it wasn't a TV dinner and you had pizza, again, that was the most exciting thing. And you know what? I remember when McDonald's was a treat. Okay, people have McDonald's every single day, and I remember when McDonald's was a treat.
Yeah, I remember when KFC was a treat, but like
Do
you're
you
looking
remember
at
the styrofoam containers at McDonald's?
yes.
I guess
Oh,
I
how
do.
awesome
actually.
were they? Nothing more than having a burger with one of those styrofoam.
But do you know
containers.
what?
That was brilliant.
Speaking of my research, speaking of my homework and my research, we were watching the movie on Netflix, Founder, last night about the guy who bought out the McDonald brothers, and
I've heard about this movie, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
it's actually quite good. And what made me nostalgic, I was saying to Philip last night, is the wrappers that they put their food in, or the boxes they put their food in. To me, it's not the same as back then where you had it in and like it's nice wrapper or in a foil, and the bag was nice and
It
sort of
was
like,
stylish. Yeah.
and the food was more delicious. And like Philip said, it was a treat. KFC was a treat. Things like pizza was massive. Burgers and fries were massive. Hot dogs, TV meals. You're looking at chips. You're looking at all sorts of, different chocolates, different, ice creams, different sort of foods. Like, what was your favorite food in the 90s, or foods, if I may ask?
Actually, I'd just like to
Well,
say something before Leon says that. One thing I actually remember is that I remember when Pizza Hut had a deal where if you bought a Pizza Hut pizza, um, and you'd basically get a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle toy that went with it. And me and
McDonald's
my
did the same
brothers,
thing as well.
loved that. Okay, they absolutely loved that. And so when we actually watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the movie, and we found out that they were eating Dominoes, we were like, "That's bullshit, man! You're eating the wrong pizza."
What was what was your
They did
favorite
the same
foods and
thing.
drinks? Go.
Definitely McDonald's would have been my favorite. My second favorite would have been KFC for sure. And do you remember how when they put them in the old buckets? Those buckets used to be configured to about the right size of the amount of drumsticks in it. These days, these days the buckets are huge, and there's only about 6 or 7 bloody drumsticks in there, and all this is just empty. Remember the old days where the buckets used to be small and they had the chicken in it, and I filled the thing up nicely.
Yeah.
Oh man, I
Do you
miss those. I
remember
wish they'd bring those back.
do you remember back in the 90s how, when we look at like McDonald's or KFC or Domino's or Pizza Huts now, it's more modern than compared to back then when we were kids, that, the food was classic, it was nostalgic. You know, I remember, back then fast food was just like this on the go constantly, compared to now. Now it's boomed even more, but when fast food began, it's like pizzas, burgers, hot dogs, um,
I just look, pizzas was so popular
yeah,
during then.
chocolates and candy was I remember as a child in the 90s, in preschool and in high school, and preschool in New Zealand, and they used to take the lunch people used to come and take our orders, and we'd have the lunch money from my parents, and each kid had lunch money from their parents, and they'd take down the order on the board, and they'd take our money, and then by lunchtime they'd deliver it to the classroom. And then in high school you have a canteen where you're going, oh, I'll have a pie, or I'll have a burger, or I'll have a chicken roll, or chico roll, or whatever you want to call it. And you would buy candy, and candy was the favorite thing. You have like a vending machine full of soft drinks, and
Actually,
Oh
I
yeah.
do remember in my old school, St. Charles, that because the school was mainly made up of Italian and also Filipino people, that they decided to basically give you lasagnas every Wednesday for lunch. And that happened in the 90s. And whereas I went to Villa Maria, which is supposed to be the richer school kind of thing, you could get crappy, terrible stuff like Ovaltines, or licorice,
You hated
which is the worst thing on
Ovaltines?
earth, and other terrible candies that I'd never
Hang
want
on, hang on,
ever
hang
again.
on. Let's pause right there. Did you say you hated Ovaltines?
I did. I hated Ovaltines. And I can't believe
I
people have made it out into a big
love
shame.
them. I haven't had an Ovaltine in ages. It makes me want to go to the lolly shop out there in Windsor and see if they've got any.
do you know what drink or energy bar I would never ever have for the rest of my life? Milo.
What,
Milo.
what is your beef against Milo?
I
Apart from
don't
the
like
fact that it
Milo.
feels diluted with milk and
I
no
don't
one
like,
knows how to make it.
sorry, I just don't like Milo.
Now, what you the perfect Milo drink is, right? You put like 10 spoons of bloody Milo in there and just like a touch of milk and just stir it.
No, I'll
No,
pass.
you got to melt down the Milo for a start, and they don't tell you on the back of the packet because they want you to buy as many tins as possible. But you're meant to
I'm gonna
melt
put
down
that
the
on my
Milo
ice cream.
in hot water and turn it into a hot chocolate. That's what you're meant
No,
to do with
thank
it.
you. Does
My
anyone
dad
remember?
does that.
Does anyone remember fruit roll-ups?
Yes.
I do.
I used to
Actually.
have them. I haven't had them in ages, but I used to have
too.
them.
They used to stick to the top of your teeth or your gum,
Hmm.
and it'd be sort of hard to get out, and you're like digging it out.
Do you know what I used to remember? Actually, I used to remember that you had shapes that came out and tiny teddies. They also came out
Oh,
during the
tiny
90s.
teddies.
Oh man.
Chocolate ones were my faves.
You know, so that I just remember that was something that specifically came out of the 90s. And barbecue shapes, that was a winner for me. Like when
What
they
about
came out,
tasty tubes?
that was great. That was great.
Hey,
What about tasty tubes?
oh, I love
Remember
tubes.
those chips? They're coming back. Woo!
Yeah, so about time though. About
yeah.
time. And what about the soft drinks? Like, I don't know if you remember this ad they when we were kids in the 90s. They did this ad, and I don't know if for what reason it featured Savage Garden, which was the cherry cola, if you remember.
That was an
Oh, yeah.
American concept, and that was so over promoted. Like when I heard about a cherry Coke, I thought this has got to be the most amazing thing ever. It's like Coca-Cola, but not. This has got to be the most amazing thing. And I tasted it and I thought this is disgusting.
So did I.
You know, but I
Sorry,
expected it
Coca-Cola.
to be the best drink on the planet, kind of thing. I expected it to be the best drink on the planet. You know,
Suckers.
yeah,
Take
exactly.
your
It's like,
money.
Can I ask a question? I know TV trays were all like 60s, 70s, and 80s, but did we still have TV dinners in the 90s? Because if you watch The Simpsons, they're always having TV dinners.
well,
They
the
also
thing is,
they also cracked jokes about TV dinners and The Simpsons as well back in the 90s. So I'd say
But-
yes.
But do you think they should bring back TV dinners?
well, the thing is that the problem is that the quality of the TV dinner has changed. So what I understood to be a TV dinner is you got proper food. Sometimes you got spaghetti. Sometimes you actually got real chicken schnitzels, and it was a pretty decent meal for the cost. And it came in a silver container instead of, say, a black container. Now you have lean cuisines, which they treat like TV dinners, but it tastes like crap.
It's on a plastic plate as well.
Yeah.
You know, so
But-
yeah.
But do you think they should bring back the original TV dinners?
Oh, I think so.
Oh, absolutely, because there were different portions back then. These days they try to cheap you a little bit. Take a few off here and a few off there and still charge you the same price.
They try to starve you like you live in a third world country. That's what they try to do. Basically. The old TV dinners would fill me and I would not need dessert. The new ones, you need to have an entire truck to fill you.
Okay, here's
and with TV dinners, you don't get leftovers, you get reruns.
Exactly.
Ah,
Exactly.
zing! Gotcha. I
Drop-
love that.
I'd
one.
say drop the
I
mic,
love
but I
this
want to hear the
thing.
rest of the story.
That was a drop the mic zinger moment. Drop the mic zinger moment. Here's the next question. Favorite cartoons I've written down as The Simpsons. Philip is named Amazing. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Captain Planet. What else was there out there that I don't remember?
What was that other one? I remember DuckTales. That one was great. I loved DuckTales.
DuckTales.
If I did mention DuckTales earlier.
But wasn't there Aladdin? You know what? I really liked Aladdin.
Wasn't that the movie?
That was the movie, but they also turned it into a series as well.
But can I ask something? With all these cartoons that was in the 90s, I'm a huge Simpsons girl, but I have to say in the 90s, most parents did not allow their children to watch The Simpsons because they felt that the Simpsons were very R-rated and very controversial, and there were things that were, against people's thoughts or opinions or beliefs, and it's sort of, I remember, parents switching off their TVs because
I
kids
actually,
would sneak in to watch it.
well, actually, I do remember that The Simpsons actually did in the early '90s did actually get a complaint when they did those Treehouse of Horrors,
Horrors. Yeah.
like the first one that they did, and then they had to write a response to that in the form of a cartoon to say, well, if you don't actually like it, please switch it off.
Yeah.
And that was weird for a
Oh, okay.
cartoon, kind of, for
And
that to ever happen.
also, if you remember the episode of Bart being kicked out of school and sent to a Catholic school, and then he converts to Catholicism, and then Homer goes to stop him, and then he turns
And
to
he ends up
Catholicism.
joining as well.
And then Marge and Reverend Lovejoy and Ned Flanders all start sort of ganging up on Homer and Bart. And then you have the Christian world versus the Catholic world where they had this, they were angry because, the Vatican was for Bart and Homer becoming Catholics and saying the rosary. And then it was like the Christian world getting angry saying, well, that's not true. And, that's not right. And, it was hard because they were, sort of saying things, and the Catholic world was getting upset because it was an episode of The Simpsons about Super Bowl episode where the girls ended up in nuns outfits with short skirts and crosses and things like that. And
yeah, the Catholic Church, we've made some changes.
but how my thing is, how taboo was The Simpsons when kids were actually sneaking in to watch it at their friends' houses instead of coming home and watching it, because they weren't allowed to watch it because it's, one, very R-rated, and two, there were things that parents didn't allow, being that it's
the thing
R-rated.
is, I was actually allowed to watch that, like The Simpsons. So I never really had that problem. But you know what? One thing I do remember is that the original Simpsons was more centered around family values and also family problems, which is a different, because most comedies back in the day, particularly cartoons, were pretty family friendly or whatever. But it was The Simpsons that really decided to attack family problems, which was a new spin on cartoons. You already had that with normal sitcoms, but you saw that in things like Neighbours and Home and Away, not cartoons.
But don't forget, in The Simpsons, because there's a lot of cuss words, and back then it was like, oh, they swore, or Bart Simpson said something, or he's a bad child. It actually, parents were scared because they were worried that their kids would learn bad things from Bart Simpson. Like, I didn't do it, nobody saw me do it, no one can prove anything. And that, they were teaching their kids, don't follow the Simpsons, don't listen to Bart Simpson, and they swear too much, or they make Homer look silly and daft and uneducated. And back then it was just, The Simpsons drew a lot of criticism.
It was really popular, and it like that one show. I mean, I think it won an Academy Award even.
It's won several.
It's actually won a few awards. Actually, it's a pretty unique cartoon in the sense that it's been able to win its own awards.
But if you look at The Simpsons then and look at The Simpsons now, and we're talking about woke movements, now they have to change. Even Family Guy, they have to change their voiceover actors because the woke movement doesn't like the fact that other people are voicing people like Apu or Moses Slack
that was
this guy or that guy.
That was the other thing. So The Simpsons was based on stereotypes. And back then it was okay to have stereotypes. I mean, it wasn't 100% politically correct, but people were able to just go, okay, this is a stereotype. I don't like it, but it's not World War III.
But do you know what? Being a huge Simpsons girl, I have to say they're still as fresh and as funny to this day. They're hilarious.
I agree. I'm with you on that. But I would have preferred, when all this woke movement started, like it started coming down hard on, like the likes of Family Guy, The Simpsons, South Park. I would have just liked to have seen, if this is what you want, we'll counsel The Simpsons. Go off with dignity before being forced to change. Now that I was really surprised and disappointed when the Simpsons decided to go that way. They decided, all right, we've heard these guys, we're going to start bringing some of these guys in. But they brought in some, I can't remember the guy's name, but to replace Carl, I think. I just can't remember. I can't remember the guy's name.
Carl, yeah.
But yeah, because he's now replaced by a different voice. Now they were talking about woke movements. This fella here, right? I can't, like I said, I'm just trying to remember his name. I'm if I can remember his name soon enough, I can actually remember this. Now, you want to talk about woke movement? If we were going to make it race and race equality or whatever,
They did that with the
then
poo.
this-
So
yeah,
they
this
wanted to
person
change a
here-
poo. They didn't
Yeah,
like
they
the
also-
fact that was a poo was
Yeah, that
Indian.
it was an Indian. That it was an Indian stereotype, and that didn't stop there. And they started forcing character changes in The Simpsons. Like obviously Carl was changed, Hibbert was also changed to a different voice. But my point is, if you want to talk about woke change culture, that fella there that's now doing the voice of Carl Carlson should not be doing the voice of Barney Rubble in the new version of the Flintstones. Because Barney Rubble is a white character being voiced by a black fella.
Yeah. Well, my thing is Barney Rubble is meant to be seen as an idiot. That's it. That's his
Fred
whole
Flintstone.
character is
He's a bumbling pig.
I'm a white
The
idiot.
point is, if we're going on this woke bandwagon, then shouldn't that guy no longer be voicing Barney Rubble?
Correct.
Okay, personally, it's hard for me to say, but like I always saw, I think for Barney Rubble, you need to basically get the one voice that sounds like a bumbling idiot, because that's exactly
Too
what
bad we don't
Barney
have
Rubble is.
Rick Moranis could have done that. Rick
Exactly.
Moranis, didn't he play the voice of Barney Rubble in the live action version?
Yes,
of the
he did.
Flintstones
He
movie?
did. He did.
Anyway,
Last question of the night. Last question. If you could go back in time to travel to the 90s, what would you bring back and why?
okay, that's a really good question.
I think I'd bring back money. Money and shoes, maybe shoes, clothing, tie-dye clothes.
You know what? I'd probably bring back money as well. I'll tell you why, because money was different in the 90s
Compared to now.
than it is now. Money was actually bigger. It was made of different paper. It
Yes.
had different
I was-
designs on it. It was more colorful.
Wouldn't
and-
say it was
We had
colorful.
1 and 2 cent pieces back then too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so like apart from money, what else? What else
I'd bring
would I
back
buy?
clothes and shoes.
Me, I
Um,
would bring back the money, and I would bring back McDonald's styrofoam
I'll bring back
containers.
Walkman.
Do you know what I would bring back? I would bring back some basketball cards for sure. I'd try and find that very unique Michael Jordan rookie that everyone's sorted for in the 90s, and bring it back to now and sell it. That's
Make a fortune.
Oh, for the record, I have to make a correction because I said it was Carl that was the new voice. So it was Kevin Michael Richardson. He's the voice. He's the new voice of Dr. Hibbert. I was on the right track there, but it was Kevin Michael Richardson. He is now the voice of Dr. Hibbert. He used to be Harry Shearer from 1990 to 2021. Now it's Kevin Michael Richardson. Kevin Michael Richardson's also the voice of Barney Rubble in the upgraded version of the Flintstones.
Well, there you go. There
Right.
you go. I would bring back, the last thing I'll say is I'll bring back money. I'd bring back tie-dye clothes, and I'd bring back the Walkman.
Wasn't tie-dye clothes mainly 80s?
And the 90s.
Okay, I'll go with what you're saying there because I
I think-
always remember the tie-dye from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I don't really remember much.
It
now.
was in the 90s. It was quite popular, and it's even coming back now. But I'll bring back, the last thing I'll bring is the Walkman. Last thing, what would you bring back besides money?
Oh,
The CD
probably.
man and the Walkman.
Do you know what I'd bring back? Probably Keppers, because I really liked Keppers. Do you remember those? Because they went out of fashion, but I always loved the Keppers. I like the idea of the Keppers.
What's the cappers?
They were pants actually,
Ah.
Kepper pants, and I
Why didn't you just say
know that they turned
pants?
into a fad, but I really loved them. I really did. I really loved
What
them.
what would be the last thing you bring?
Oh man, I would bring back the old money. The I remember the old notes. Those old notes were brilliant. The old coins. You can't really say you bring back CDs or vinyl records because they're already coming back. Or I would definitely bring back the McDonald's styrofoam containers because you'd never had a
Yes.
decent burger without them.
Okay.
They were they were brilliant. Screw your environment.
Okay.
Well, they were
Here's
bigger for a start. You got better. The cheeseburgers were actually bigger in the styrofoam than they are in the current containers now.
here's one
And if
last
you got and if hang on, and if you got bored, not only could you eat the burger, you could eat the styrofoam container as well.
Brilliant.
the one last random question is the one last random question I'll throw out then this is a rando, which is if you saw yourself in the 90's and you traveled to the 90's and you saw yourself and you sat down next to yourself, what would you say to yourself? What advice would you give yourself to remember now so that years from now they could look back at it at the time now and go, wow, that's so important for me to learn and remember. What advice would you give yourself or what would you tell yourself? Oh, he's laughing.
You're laughing. Go on.
Sorry, just trying to compose myself because there's so many opportunities there. But no. I would say, whatever you do, don't interrupt the timeline. We can figure this out ourselves.
You know what I would say to myself? I'd say to myself, take your time in dating boys, concentrate on your goals and dreams, and have a vision board for yourself because, you know, don't don't be too crazy. Enjoy life and stay a kid. And remember that popularity isn't everything. And enjoy your life as transition from child to preteen to teen to young adult to adult. Remember that, one day you are going to be somebody and, there are going to be haters out there. But what matters is the people who love you and respect you and are real friends who will tell you straight what they think and defend you and stand up for you because those real people are your friends and they become your family. Don't worry about negativity and hater. Just be yourself and be happy. That's what I would say. What would you say to yourself? If
I,
you saw
I
yourself?
I would basically say don't wait till year 7 to learn karate. Learn it as quickly as possible. I probably shouldn't be saying that. No, probably would have said, look, be more active in sports and things like that because I definitely thought I had a lot of potential to be more active, and I just never did that because I just didn't think I was good enough to join any sports. And I think that if I just gave myself a little bit of encouragement to be part of a team, then that would have just boosted my confidence and it would have made my life a different story, I think.
What would you say?
I was always good at sports. You know how nuts I was on sports in the 90's. What I would do, because I used to play junior Aussie rules football, right? I used to play it for the Penrith Rams just for completionist purposes. And what I would do, I would get my bike when I used to live in St Mary's. I would ride from St Mary's all the way down to Cambridge Park. I think it might have been Cambridge Park at the time. Used to go down to Grey Guns Reserve to play that game of a junior AFL after riding an hour on the bike or whatever, how long it was. And then after I was done with my game, I got on my bike and rode all the way back home. So it was like 3 hours of exercise just to do all that, because I was always into sports. So that was the reason why I was fit for so long. And apart from that, yeah, apart from that, I used to do all sorts of sports. But if I was to tell myself anything, finish high school
Good point.
and stood up for yourself and stood up to all those bullies because I was bullied all my freaking life. I just wish I'd stood
I
up to
know,
them.
same here.
Mm.
The last thing I would tell myself is when you get a job, plan your future, start saving, travel the world, because one day you're not going to get an opportunity to travel the world because you could be stuck at home wondering where life went and what happened to life. As we're talking about a pandemic, we never knew about a pandemic years ago. I would have told myself, when you get a job, move out, get your own place, find the love of your life, travel the world and be happy. That's what I would think.
Okay.
Final thoughts?
No, I think you're spot on there.
Okay. Well, that's
And
all.
this party next door is getting louder and louder. I don't know whether or not you can hear it.
No. Well, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you next week with a different topic. For myself and Buckets on the end, good night. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and hit that bell. Tell your friends about us. I'll give you a shout out.
Logo.
See the logo.
See the
We're
logo,
legit now.
The logo down below.
Down below. Good night.